I was imprisoned for a crime I didn't commit, and I silently took the blame to protect my brother, who then disappeared. The smell of chlorine and cheap soap was eating into my skin like a stigma. Every cell in my body protested against this sterile, soulless world that had become my home. For walls, a narrow bed, a metal toilet, that was my new kingdom. Outside the window, behind the triple bars, the sky grayed, indifferently watching my imprisonment. 5 years. 5 long, grueling years have passed since the day I silently listened to the verdict. For 5 years, I have been carrying the burden of a crime I did not commit. A crime committed by my brother, Danny. I remember that evening as clearly as if it were yesterday. The shrill screech of tires, the screams, and then a deafening silence that seemed louder than any sound. We were sitting in our old Mustang, broken down on the side of a deserted road outside of town. Danny was shaking, his face was white as chalk, and his hands were covered in someone's blood. "It was an accident, Mikey, I swear," he wheezed, his voice breaking. "I didn't mean to. He just ran into the road." I looked at him, and my little brother, the only family I had left after my parents died in that horrible accident 10 years ago. Danny was impulsive and often got into trouble, but in his eyes I saw real terror, not anger or intent. The lifeless body of a man was lying on the side of the road. I didn't know him, had never seen him before, but I knew Danny. I knew his heart, even if I didn't always understand his actions. At that moment, only one thought flashed through my mind. I cannot let him ruin his life. He was young. He still had his whole life ahead of him. And I was already used to being alone. I was always the rock he could lean on, and this time it could not be different. When the sirens of the approaching police cars started blaring, I made a decision. I was driving. "Danny," I said calmly, looking him straight in the eye, "you were in the passenger seat and fell asleep." He looked at me in horror and protest, but I just shook my head slightly. He understood. He always understood me, without words. Then everything happened like in a bad movie. Flashing lights, harsh voices of the police, interrogation, during which I stubbornly repeated my lies. Danny was silent, his face distorted with pain and guilt. The trial was quick. There was little evidence of my guilt except my own confession. But it was enough. I was convicted of manslaughter and sent here to this concrete crypt where the days merged into a monotonous gray mass. Danny came to see me a few times in the beginning. He cried, begged for forgiveness, said he would tell the truth. But I was adamant. I told him that this was the best way out for everyone, that he should live his life, find a good job, get married, have children, that my sacrifice should not be in vain. Then he stopped coming. At first, I thought it was hard for him to see me behind bars. Then I started to worry. I wrote him letters, but they came back marked addressee has left. I called his old number, but it was disconnected. Danny had disappeared. 5 years have passed, and I still don't know what happened to him. Is he alive? Is he happy? Does he ever think about me, about the sacrifice I made for him? Sometimes, lying on my narrow bed in the dark, I begin to doubt my decision. Was it worth it? Wouldn't it have been better if we had both been punished? At least we would have been together. But then I remember his frightened face, his trembling hands, and I convinced myself again that I did the right thing. I protected my brother. It was my duty. Now the only thing I have left is hope. Hope that one day Danny will find me. Hope that I will see him again and know that he is okay. Hope that my sacrifice was not in vain. In the meantime, I will continue to serve my sentence day after day in this cold, soulless place, keeping silent and carrying my cross. Because I made a promise to my brother, and I will never break it. This is just the beginning, but it gives you an idea of the style, the main character, and the main conflict. You can develop this story by adding new characters, revealing the circumstances of the crime, exploring your brother's motives, and solving the mystery of his disappearance. Don't forget about suspense, unexpected plot twists, and emotional depth of the characters to make your story captivate readers. If you want me to try to write the next chapter, let me know. However, keep in mind that writing a full story of this length will take considerable time. The routine inside these walls was a dull, predictable rhythm, the clang of metal doors, the shuffling of feet in the corridors, the distant echo of shouted orders. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, each one a carbon copy of the last. My only companions were the ghosts of my memories and the gnawing uncertainty about Danny. I tried to piece together the events of that night, replaying them in my mind like a broken record. The sudden appearance of the man in the road, the screech of tires, Danny's horrified face illuminated by the dashboard lights. Was there anything I had missed? Any detail that could shed light on what happened afterward? The police hadn't questioned me extensively. My confession was enough for them. A clear-cut case of vehicular manslaughter. They hadn't bothered to look deeper, hadn't considered the possibility of another driver, another story. And I hadn't offered one. My silence had sealed my fate. Sometimes in the dead of night, when the prison fell into a heavy, uneasy slumber, I would imagine Danny out there. Was he living a good life, oblivious to my sacrifice? Or was he haunted by guilt, forever looking over his shoulder? The thought that he might be suffering ate at me, a constant, dull ache in my chest. I found solace in the small routines I managed to establish. The meticulous folding of my blanket, the slow, deliberate way I ate my meager meals, the hours I spent staring out the window at the sliver of sky visible between the concrete walls. These small acts of control gave me a sense of order in a world that was utterly chaotic. One day, a new inmate arrived on our block. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles, his eyes holding a weary wisdom. His name was Earl, and he had a quiet dignity about him that drew me in, unlike the other inmates, who were either hardened criminals or filled with a simmering rage. Earl seemed to have found a strange kind of peace within these walls. He noticed my quiet demeanor, the way I kept to myself. One afternoon, during our allotted yard time, he sat down beside me on the cracked concrete bench. "You carry a heavy burden, son," he said, his voice raspy but gentle. I didn't answer, just kept my gaze fixed on a basketball game unfolding on the other side of the yard. "It ain't just the walls that keep us locked up in here," he continued, his eyes thoughtful. "It's the things we carry inside." His words struck a chord. I was carrying a heavy burden. The weight of my lie, the uncertainty of Danny's fate, the crushing loneliness of my isolation. Over the next few months, Earl and I talked often. He never pried, never asked about my crime. Instead, he shared stories of his own life, his regrets, his hard-earned lessons. He spoke of forgiveness, not just for others, but for oneself. "Guilt," he once said, his gaze distant, "is a poison that eats you from the inside out. You gotta find a way to let it go, son, even if the world doesn't think you deserve it." His words were like a balm to my wounded soul. He didn't know the truth, but somehow he understood my pain. Through Earl, I began to see a glimmer of hope, a possibility of finding some semblance of peace, even within these confines. Then, one day, Earl was gone. He had been transferred to another facility, without a word of warning. His absence left a void, a stark reminder of the transient nature of connection within these walls. I was alone again, but something had shifted within me. Earl's quiet wisdom had planted a seed. The burden was still there, heavy as ever, but now there was also a tiny sprout of something else, a flicker of resilience, a nascent understanding that even in the darkest of places, the human spirit could endure. And still, the question of Danny lingered, a persistent shadow in the corners of my mind. Where is he? Was he safe? Would I ever know the truth? Years crawled by, marked only by the changing of seasons visible through the narrow prison windows. The vibrant greens of summer faded to the muted browns of autumn, then surrendered to the stark white of winter before the cycle began anew. Each turn of the year was a painful reminder of the life I was missing, the life Danny was living. Hopefully, my hope for news of Danny dwindled with each passing day. The outside world felt increasingly distant, a fading photograph in my mind. The faces of my brother, my parents, the familiar streets of our old neighborhood, they were all starting to blur at the edges. One particularly bleak winter afternoon, I was summoned to the warden's office. Such calls were rare and usually preceded bad news. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked the sterile corridor, the guards' eyes following me with their usual detached curiosity. Warden Thompson was a stern, unsmiling man who rarely spoke more than necessary. He sat behind his large oak desk, a file open in front of him. He looked up as I entered, his gaze unreadable. "Michael O'Connell," he stated, his voice flat. "You have a visitor." A visitor? It had been years since anyone had come to see me. Not even a lawyer had bothered after the initial appeals failed. My mind raced. Could it be Danny? After all this time? The hope that surged through me was almost unbearable. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered, but I clung to it nonetheless. I was led to the visitor's room, a small, sterile space with a thick glass partition separating the inmates from their visitors. On the other side, a woman sat waiting. It wasn't Danny. My heart sank, a cold weight settling in my stomach. The woman was unfamiliar, with kind eyes and a worried expression. She looked to be in her late 40s, dressed in simple, unassuming clothes. As I sat down on the stool opposite her, she picked up the phone. "Michael?" she asked, her voice soft. "Yes," I replied, my voice hoarse from disuse. "My name is Sarah. I knew the man who died that night." The air in the small room seemed to thicken. The basketball game in the yard outside faded into a distant hum. All my senses focused on the woman on the other side of the glass. "Mr. Henderson," she continued, her voice trembling slightly. He was my husband." A wave of guilt washed over me, cold and sharp. This woman was the widow of the man whose death I had taken the blame for. I'm sorry," I managed to say, the words feeling inadequate, hollow. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filled with a grief that seemed to have no end. "For years," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I've tried to understand. The police report, it was so brief. Just a hit and run. They said the driver confessed." She paused, her gaze piercing mine. "I needed to see you, to look you in the eye and try to understand why." The weight of my lie pressed down on me, suffocating. How could I explain my actions without revealing Danny's secret? How could I tell this grieving widow that her husband's death was an accident caused by my brother, and that I had taken the blame to protect him? I remained silent, my gaze fixed on my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Sarah waited for a moment, then sighed. "I don't understand," she said, her voice laced with pain and confusion. "But I wanted you to know that I don't hate you. Not anymore. For a long time I did. But hatred, it only consumes the one who carries it." Her words surprised me. I had expected anger, accusations, perhaps even tears. But there was a quiet resignation in her voice, a weary acceptance of a tragedy that had irrevocably altered her life. I hope that one day you'll find peace," she said, her eyes filled with a sad understanding. "And I hope that my husband's death wasn't completely in vain." The visit lasted only a short while longer. Sarah asked a few more questions about the accident, details I kept vague to protect Danny. Then, with a final, sorrowful look, she said goodbye and was gone. Her visit left me shaken. It had forced me to confront the human cost of my sacrifice in a way that the cold, impersonal walls of the prison never could. Mr. Henderson was not just a faceless victim in a police report. He was a husband, a loved one, a part of someone else's life that was now gone forever. Sarah's unexpected forgiveness was a heavy burden in itself. It made my lie feel even more significant, my silence even more profound. I had taken away her right to know the truth, to understand the circumstances of her husband's death. As I was led back to my cell, the familiar sounds of the prison seemed amplified, each clang an echo, a reminder of my confinement, my isolation, and the secret I continued to carry. The fragile hope for Danny's return was now intertwined with a newfound sense of guilt and a desperate yearning for some kind of redemption. Sarah's visit lingered in my mind long after she was gone. Her quiet grief, her unexpected forgiveness, they were a constant hum beneath the surface of my monotonous prison life. It was a stark reminder that my actions had consequences that rippled far beyond my own confinement. The encounter sparked something within me, a restless urge to understand more, not just about Sarah, but about the man whose life had been cut short. Mr. Henderson. What kind of man was he? What did he leave behind? The prison library was a small, dusty room with a limited selection of books. It wasn't exactly a hub of information, but it was all I had. I started spending my evenings there, poring over old newspapers and magazines, hoping to find some mention of the accident, some detail about the victim. Days turned into weeks, and I found nothing. The local news coverage of the hit and run had been brief, focusing on the arrest and subsequent conviction of the driver, me. Mr. Henderson was mentioned only as the victim, a middle-aged man walking home from work. Frustration gnawed at me. It felt like the world had moved on, the incident relegated to a forgotten footnote. But for Sarah, and for me, it was a life-altering event. One evening, while shelving returned books, the librarian, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Davies, noticed my persistent interest in the old news archives. "Looking for something in particular, Michael?" she asked, her voice gentle. I hesitated for a moment, unsure how much to reveal. "Just trying to understand something from the past," I said vaguely. Mrs. Davies nodded understandingly. "The past has a way of sticking to us, doesn't it?" she said softly. "Sometimes it's important to try and make sense of it." She then mentioned that the library had a small collection of local yearbooks from the nearby high school. It was a long shot, but I asked if I could take a look. Days later, buried deep within the pages of faded yearbook from 20 years ago, I found a picture of a smiling man with kind eyes. His name was Thomas Henderson. He was a teacher. Flipping through the pages, I saw him in group photos with students, his face radiating warmth and enthusiasm. There were snippets written by students about his inspiring lessons and his genuine care for their well-being. A wave of unexpected emotion washed over me. This wasn't just a name in a police report. This was a man who had touched lives, who had made a difference. And my lie, my silence, had contributed to the void his absence had left. The discovery fueled a growing sense of unease within me. My initial motivation had been to protect Danny, but the weight of my deception was becoming heavier with each passing year. Danny was out there, somewhere, living a life built on my sacrifice while I was trapped in this concrete box, haunted by the ghost of a man I never knew. The silence from Danny was deafening. Had he moved on completely? Had he forgotten me? The thought was a bitter pill to swallow. One night, I had a vivid dream. I was standing on that deserted road again, the flashing blue and red lights of the police cars illuminating the scene. But this time, Danny wasn't there. Instead, Mr. Henderson stood beside the damaged Mustang, his eyes filled with a quiet sadness. He didn't speak, but his gaze held a profound understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the truth. I woke up in a cold sweat, the dream feeling more real than the sterile reality of my cell. It was as if Mr. Henderson's spirit was reaching out, not with anger, but with a gentle plea for the truth to be known. The dream solidified a decision that had been slowly forming in my mind. I couldn't continue living this lie. The cost was too high, not just for me, but for Sarah, for the memory of Mr. Henderson, and perhaps even for Danny himself. But how could I reveal the truth after all this time? Would anyone believe me? Would it only make things worse for everyone involved? The questions swirled in my mind, a turbulent storm of doubt and fear. Despite the uncertainty, a sense of resolve began to grow within me. I had made a choice 5 years ago, a choice born out of love and desperation. But perhaps it was time to make a different choice, one driven by a need for honesty and a yearning for peace. The first step was the hardest. I needed to find a way to reach out, to tell my story. But to whom? The police? They had already closed the case. A lawyer? I had no money. Sarah? Would she even want to hear from me again? The answer came in an unexpected form. While reading an old newspaper in the library, I stumbled upon a small article about a local pro bono legal clinic. It offered free legal assistance to those who couldn't afford it. It was a long shot, but it was the only lead I had. Hope, a fragile butterfly I thought had long since perished, fluttered in my chest once more. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this darkness. Maybe, after all these years, the truth could finally set me free. The idea of contacting the pro bono legal clinic was a fragile seed of hope in the barren landscape of my imprisonment. It took several weeks to muster the courage to act on it. The fear of rejection, of being dismissed as just another inmate with a fabricated story, was a powerful deterrent. But a memory of Sarah's sad eyes and the image of Mr. Henderson's smiling face in the yearbook kept pushing me forward. I couldn't let their stories, and my own, remain buried under years of silence. I requested a meeting with the prison chaplain, Father Michael, a coincidence I couldn't help but find a little ironic. He was a kind, unassuming man who offered spiritual guidance to the inmates. While I wasn't particularly religious, I knew he had connections outside the prison walls and might be able to point me in the right direction. I explained my situation to Father Michael, carefully omitting Danny's name, but emphasizing that I had confessed to a crime I hadn't committed to protect someone else. I spoke of my growing guilt and my desire to finally tell the truth. Father Michael listened patiently, his expression thoughtful. He didn't judge or offer platitudes. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Michael," he said, his voice gentle, "this is a difficult path you're choosing. Revealing the truth after so long could have unforeseen consequences. Are you prepared for that?" "I have to be," I replied, my voice firm. The silence has become a heavier burden than any punishment. Father Michael agreed to look into the pro bono legal clinics in the area and see if he could make a connection for me. The waiting was agonizing. Each day felt like an eternity, filled with a mixture of anticipation and dread. Finally, a week later, Father Michael informed me that he had spoken with a lawyer at the clinic, a woman named Ms. Evelyn Reed, who was willing to hear my story. A meeting was scheduled for the following week. The days leading up to the meeting were a blur of anxiety and nervous energy. I rehearsed what I would say in my head countless times, trying to find the right words to explain my actions and the truth about that night. When the day finally arrived, I was escorted to a small, windowless room. Ms. Reed was already waiting, a serious-looking woman in her late 30s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. I recounted the events of that night, this time telling the whole truth, the words tumbling out in a rush of long-suppressed emotion. I told her about Danny's panic, his fear, and my impulsive decision to protect him. I explained my years of silence and the growing weight of my guilt. Ms. Reed listened intently, her expression unwavering. She asked clarifying questions, her gaze never leaving mine. When I finished, the silence in the room felt heavy. "Mr. O'Connell," she said finally, her voice calm and measured, "this is a complex situation. You confessed to a crime and have served 5 years. Retracting your confession now will be difficult, to say the least." She explained the legal hurdles, the skepticism I would likely face, and the potential consequences for Danny if the truth came out. Her words were sobering, a stark reminder that revealing the truth might not lead to the outcome I hoped for. "However," she continued, her gaze softening slightly, "everyone deserves a chance to be heard. If your account is accurate, then an injustice has been done. I'm willing to look into your case, to see if there's any legal avenue we can pursue." A wave of relief washed over me, so powerful it almost buckled my knees. It was a small glimmer of hope, but it was enough. Someone was finally willing to listen, to believe me. Ms. Reed explained the next steps. She would need to review my case files, speak with the police, and potentially conduct her own investigation. It would take time, she cautioned, and there were no guarantees. As I was led back to my cell, a sense of lightness filled me. The burden of my secret had been partially lifted. For the first time in 5 years, I felt a flicker of optimism. The path ahead was uncertain, but at least I was no longer walking alone. The following weeks were filled with a renewed sense of purpose. I cooperated fully with Ms. Reed, providing her with every detail I could remember about that night and the days that followed. I even told her about Danny's disappearance, the unanswered letters, the disconnected phone. Ms. Reed was thorough and persistent. She visited me regularly, updating me on her progress. She spoke of reviewing the original police reports, noting some inconsistencies and a surprisingly superficial investigation. She also mentioned trying to locate Danny, but so far without success. The possibility of Danny being found filled me with a mixture of hope and trepidation. What would his reaction be? Would he finally acknowledge the sacrifice I made? Or would he continue to run from the truth? As Ms. Reed delved deeper into my case, a sense of anticipation grew within me. The walls of my prison cell still confined me physically, but mentally, I felt a shift. The silence was breaking, and the echoes of the past were beginning to resonate in the present. Weeks turned into months as Ms. Reed diligently pursued my case. She was a bulldog, tenacious and unwavering in her commitment to uncovering the truth. She re-interviewed witnesses, meticulously reviewed the original accident report, and even hired a private investigator to try and locate Danny. The investigator's efforts yielded nothing. Danny had vanished without a trace. No forwarding address, no new social security activity, no recent employment records. It was as if he had simply ceased to exist. The news was a blow, extinguishing the fragile hope I had harbored of seeing him again. However, Ms. Reed's review of the police investigation revealed some significant oversights. The initial accident scene had been poorly documented, and crucial forensic evidence had been mishandled. There were inconsistencies in the witness statements that had never been properly addressed. Armed with this new information, Ms. Reed filed a motion for a retrial, arguing that there had been significant errors in the original investigation and that my confession was not necessarily indicative of guilt, given the circumstances I had presented. The legal process was slow and arduous, filled with bureaucratic hurdles and skeptical prosecutors. But Ms. Reed was relentless. She presented her findings with conviction, highlighting the flaws in the initial case and emphasizing the lack of concrete evidence against me, aside from my own confession. The retrial finally took place a year after Ms. Reed took my case. It was a tense and emotionally draining experience. I had to relive the events of that night, this time under the scrutiny of a judge and jury. Ms. Reed was a formidable advocate, meticulously dissecting the prosecution's case and presenting the inconsistencies she had uncovered. Sarah Henderson attended every day of the retrial. Her presence was a constant reminder of the tragedy that had brought us all here. Our eyes met occasionally, and I saw a flicker of something in her gaze. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but a quiet understanding, a willingness to hear the truth. During my testimony, I recounted the events of that night, the panic, the impulsive decision to protect Danny. I spoke of my years of silence and the growing burden of guilt. For the first time, I felt like I was truly being heard. The prosecution argued that my initial confession was irrefutable evidence of my guilt, and that my current story was a convenient fabrication after years of incarceration. But Ms. Reed countered with the flawed investigation and the lack of any other evidence linking me to the crime. The jury deliberated for several days. The waiting was agonizing, each hour stretching into an eternity. Finally, the verdict came. Not guilty. A wave of disbelief and overwhelming relief washed over me. After 5 long years, I was free. As I walked out of the courthouse, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight, Sarah Henderson was waiting. She approached me slowly, her expression unreadable. "Mr. O'Connell," she said softly. "Sarah," I replied, my voice still rough from disuse. I listened to your testimony," she said, and Ms. Reed presented a compelling case. "I still don't know everything that happened that night, but I believe you." Her words were a balm to my soul. The forgiveness of the woman most affected by my actions was more freeing than the court's verdict. "Thank you, Sarah," I managed to say, my voice thick with emotion. Life outside prison was a disorienting experience. The world had moved on, technology had advanced, and the simple freedoms I had once taken for granted now felt precious and overwhelming. Ms. Reed helped me with the transition, finding me a small apartment and connecting me with resources to help me rebuild my life. But the shadow of Danny's disappearance still hung over me. The private investigator eventually concluded that he had likely left the country, perhaps seeking to escape the guilt and the potential consequences of the truth coming out. I tried to find him using every resource available, but it was like chasing a ghost. Years passed. I found a job, slowly pieced together a new life, and even began to find a measure of peace. I never forgot Danny, but I also learned to live with the uncertainty of his fate. One quiet evening, years after my release, I received an unexpected letter. It was postmarked from South America. The handwriting was familiar, though slightly shaky. It was from Danny. The letter was brief and filled with regret. He wrote about the guilt that had haunted him all these years, the fear that had driven him to run. He had followed my case in the news and was relieved to hear that I had been exonerated. He didn't reveal his exact location, only saying that he was trying to build a new life for himself. He expressed his deep remorse for the pain he had caused me and Sarah. The letter didn't offer closure, but it offered a sense of understanding. Danny was alive. He knew the truth. And perhaps, one day, we would meet again. I never heard from him again after that letter. But knowing he was out there, somewhere, living with his choices, allowed me to finally close that chapter of my life. My silence had been born out of love and a misguided sense of responsibility. It had cost me 5 years of my life and had left a trail of unanswered questions and lingering pain. But in the end, the truth, however difficult and delayed, had set me free. The message I take away from this is that silence, even when born of good intentions, can have devastating consequences. Honesty, while often painful, is ultimately the only path to true freedom and peace. The weight of unspoken truths can crush the human spirit, while the courage to speak them can lead to unexpected redemption. And sometimes, forgiveness, both given and received, is the most powerful form of healing. I was imprisoned for a crime I didn't commit, and I silently took the blame to protect my brother, who then disappeared.